All right, let's talk today. Last week we did a craft focus lesson, so I think we might do a business focus lesson this week. People tend to get very interested in these, so let's talk about agents. All right, let's do some agent discussion. What are agents? Somebody tell me what an agent is. What your perception of one is.
They're sort of representative of the author with the publishers.
Okay, yeah. What else? What's your perception?
They do all the dirty dealing and messing with contracts and getting stuff, and talking about all the money.
Okay, yeah.
Seems kind of like talent scouts. They're trying to find new talent and get them out there.
Yeah, those are each big parts of what an agent does. An agent in the literary world is very different from Hollywood agents, though they do a lot of the same work. I found that literary agents tend to be the same sort of people who would become editors if you mix into that mix a little bit more of a desire to argue. That's sort of a little bit more of that personality, a little bit more willing to be the person who goes on the author's behalf, the advocate, and things like that. And so the big parts of what an agent does, and this is why you would consider getting one, is number one, they know contracts. They are one part attorney. T-T-O-R-N-E-Y. There's none in there. There's a U too. O-U-R-N-E-Y? No, there's not a U there. Lawyer. There. One part lawyer, because they do know contracts, contract law specifically, and one of the things about contracts, and we may get into talking about contracts today, we may save that for another day. Contracts are filled with this sort of precedential language. Anyone here law student or pre-law? Okay. You can correct me if I get some of the terminology wrong, because I am not an attorney, and none of this is legal advice. Yeah, he laughs at that because that's what you're supposed to say. But there's a lot of language. You'll see like one sentence in a contract, and this sentence will have a history to it. That it means this and this and this, and it's been challenged several times in courts and upheld, meaning this. Reading it, you'd have no idea that it means all that using these three words together means a certain thing, but to everyone in the industry who knows contracts, that's what they mean. And so,
can you give an example?
No, because I pay someone to do this for me. We're in the middle of when we're in the middle of negotiations, he'll point to them, say, "That's what this means." I guess I can give one. There are things called like a best faith clause. We'll make like reasonable efforts to make sure that your cover desires are met. And whatever the certain language they use will mean that they have to like actually make a few changes when you suggest it and show it to you again, and then they can ignore what you say after that. That's legally what it means, or things like that. A lot of it's stuff like that. Cover consultation clause. They have to show it to you before at a certain stage in the process. It doesn't say what stage there. It just says, the cover. You'll have a cover consultation clause. You'll get cover consultation, which means that before they actually go to the final version of the cover, while they still have sketches, they have to show it to you and then ignore what you have to say about it. These sorts of things are what an agent knows and does. It's a big part of their job. A lot of these have to do with rights issues, meaning when the rights on the book revert to you, what rights you can then resell and which ones you can't resell. And it can get very sticky if some of the language is not specific, and particularly if it's not specific in specific ways, so that they can have something to argue for to try and, for instance, a publisher might be able to argue that they then have T-shirt rights to your book because of the way that 3 words are worded. And you just want to make sure, they probably would never do that, but you want to make sure that it's not worded in such a way that T-shirt rights are then given to the publisher or whatever. That's what the agent will do. In 75% of these cases, because authors are the talent in their respective in our fields, the clauses aren't going to matter that much, because even if there's a little ambiguity, the publisher is not going to want to risk offending the talent, meaning the author, in order to pull something off. Just like in Hollywood, generally the actors are going to be the last people they try to offend, and the writers will be the first people that they kick out to the curb, because the writer's name does not sell movie tickets, but the actor's name does. In the same way, your name sells books, and so therefore they're generally not going to try and work some of these little things. But it is good to have an agent looking at them. There are some big things that some publishers will try to work, and usually it has to do with royalties. Usually it does not have to do with rights. It has to do with royalties, and it has to do with first refusal rights on books and things like that. We'll talk about all that stuff. But anyway, if the concept of reading a contract and dealing with this sort of thing makes your brain break, an agent may be a good choice for you. You can do this yourself. If you have just enough business or law background to ask, what does this clause mean? Can we define this clause? And that sort of thing. Most everything is straightforward enough once you get a certain minimum level of legalese under your belt that you could do this yourself. I don't know if I'd recommend it, but if I had some law background or even, like I said, some business background, I might consider it.
Say you started talking with an editor or a publisher, and you were looking at the contract and you weren't certain, could you still bring in an agent to have them?
Yes, you could. Though, a lot of people would suggest at that point that you hire an IP attorney, an entertainment lawyer. Because you can, if you want, there are basically 3 routes to go on this if you want to do it. 1 is agent. 2 is IP lawyer. 3 is yourself. Yeah. And agents take 15% of everything. I wrote that wrong. 15% of everything. All right? IP lawyer is just you pay them and then they're done. It's an out-of-pocket expense. It can be fairly big. Not mondo big, but a couple $1,000 to negotiate a contract is about the upper end of what you're looking at. $500 to $1,000 is probably more normal, I would guess. Joshua and I have used an IP attorney once on a contract that we felt had extra level of craziness going on. We just hired someone else to do it. Yourself is free, except for time and headaches. So, the agent's 15% clause. That means as long as that contract is in force, they get 15% of everything that contract earns. Okay? And so, if you leave that agent, or if that agent dies and someone else in the agency inherits their contracts, they still get 15% forever for the length of the contract. All right? So that's a big chunk you're giving up.
Which is how long?
It depends on the contract. Usually, with books, there's going to be something we call a reversion of rights clause. You get the rights back if the book stops selling a certain number of copies. However, with the advent of digital publishing, that minimum threshold is so much easier to meet. 10 years ago, it would be, it has to sell 100 copies in a quarter, which doesn't sound like many, but they have to keep it in print and in bookstores to sell 100 copies a quarter. And that gets really hard for a book that's just not selling very well, and so they let it lapse out of print, and then you get the rights back. Now, they don't necessarily have to do that. There's been lots of argument over reversion of rights clauses with ebooks. They don't have to do the shelving on bookshelves if it sells a minimum number of copies. As long as you are known well enough that it does, then digital copies, then it stays at the publisher. So yeah, that's something to consider. We bought back the rights for Alcatraz because even though they were not keeping them very well in bookstores, there was enough interest because I'm a big enough author that people were ordering them off of Amazon and finding the books, even though they basically weren't in print anymore, that they were selling enough to meet the rights reversion clause, that it would never have reverted to me. They would have sold for the next 40 years. And so we just bought them back. And so, yeah. Okay, so number one, contracts. This is a pretty big deal. And it's worth considering. There are a lot of authors nowadays, particularly some of the sort of mid-listy authors, who are arguing for this more and more, rather than giving someone 15%. If you want to read people who advocate this, one of the big people who talks about this would be Joe Conrath, I think, has talked about it, and Dean Wesley Smith and his wife, Kristen Catherine Rush. Did I get her name right? Say Kristen? Something like that. I've never actually met them, but they both run blogs, and they're very vocal on them. They are, there's like this kind of choose your side going on thing in publishing right now, indie versus traditional publishing. A lot of people fall in the middle somewhere, but a lot of people fall in either camp. The blogs I just mentioned are like way over here. They're like the libertarians of indie publishing, okay? So just keep that in mind. They advocate one side to all of this that is worth reading and knowing about, but they are very extreme in their attitudes. For instance, Dean has several times said, stepped right up to the line of calling all agents crooks and thieves, and saying that no author should ever use an agent. I don't think he's actually stepped across that line and called them that, but he's right at the edge of it. He always makes the caveat for there are some good agents out there, but just be aware of that. Yes.
Can you write those names down?
You assume I can spell them. Hey, Mark, do you want to come in?
Is there room?
Yeah, there's a chair right here if you want it. Yeah. All right, let's see. Dean Wesley. So I have to actually spell it so you guys can read it rather than my normal scribbly thing. Dean Wesley Smith and J.A. C. Conrath? K. Conrath. Does anyone know? K? K. Conrath. A-O-N-R-A-T-H. Okay? Both are interesting resources that, if you're at all interested in this, you should be reading. I really do think. With the caveat that I mentioned to you, all right? I think a lot of what they say is interesting, but too extreme. However, I'm on the other side. I'm part of the publishing establishment. The establishment has treated me very well. And Joe Conrath has a story that he was a kind of a mid-list thriller writer that never felt he was getting the attention from his publisher that he deserved. A lot of his books went out of print, something like a dozen, maybe more. You'll have to read his blog. Went out of print. And so he started putting those out-of-print ones up as ebooks. And people just took off. People loved them. And so he started writing new ones and putting them up without going to the publishers. And he became a huge phenomenon writer. As a thriller writer, he posts his statistics. He makes he probably is making as much as I am in a year, if not a little more, doing self-publishing. And so that's pretty good. So he's one of the big poster boys for, yes, you can do this. Is that? So that's worth looking at.